Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. Dear listeners, we invite you to take part in a small experiment and listen to a story in reverse, where the husband is the villain and the wife is the victim. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Should we continue posting such stories, or are they not of interest to you? So, let's get started. The smell of coffee curled through the kitchen, warm and familiar, the way it did every morning. Evelyn Cross stretched, letting the early light filter through the blinds as she reached for her mug. Ian's suit hung neatly by the door, his shoes lined up beside it, just as they always were. Nothing seemed out of place. Her fingers brushed the newspaper on the counter, expecting the usual headlines. Instead, there was an envelope, its weight heavy with something unsaid. Her name was scrawled across the front in Ian's handwriting. Her pulse kicked up. She hesitated before picking it up. Ian never left notes. He called. He sent texts. He told her things in person with that measured tone that made her feel small, like she was always missing something. The paper crinkled as she opened the envelope. "I know what you did. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've left instructions." The words felt like a fist to the stomach. She read them again, slower, trying to make sense of what was in front of her. Her chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly, eyes darting around the kitchen, looking for something, anything, that would explain what this meant. Her breath came fast, a shallow, panicked rhythm that made her feel like she was suffocating. Gone. Gone where? Instructions. For what? A knock at the door shattered the quiet. The sound was sharp, businesslike. She turned toward it, her hands gripping the back of the chair as though letting go would send her falling. Through the window, she saw a truck idling in the driveway. A moving truck. A man in a work uniform stood on the porch, holding a clipboard. Another was already stepping out of the truck, calling to someone inside. Evelyn forced herself to move, each step toward the door feeling like walking into a nightmare. She pulled it open, her voice tight. "Can I help you?" The man checked the clipboard. "Mrs. Cross." "Yes. We're here to pack up your things. You're being relocated." The world tilted. "There's a mistake," she said, shaking her head. "I didn't request anything." The man sighed, as if he had heard it all before. "We have a work order, signed by Ian Cross. Everything here is scheduled to be packed and moved today." He lifted the clipboard toward her, a page full of details staring back at her. Her eyes landed on Ian's signature at the bottom. She felt the ground slip beneath her. This isn't possible," she whispered. "We were told you'd say that," the man said, then pulled out a second envelope from his pocket. "Mr. Cross left this for you, in case you had any questions." Evelyn's hand shook as she took it, her skin crawling. The men behind him were already moving, stepping past her into the house, scanning the space like they had a job to do and not much time to do it. She barely noticed them as she ripped open the envelope, her eyes darting over the words. "You're no longer welcome in this house. Your belongings will be taken where they need to go. Everything has been arranged. Do not call me. This is not a negotiation." The ink seemed to bleed under her gaze. "Where they need to go," she whispered. She turned to the worker, her voice rising. "Where are they taking my things?" "Your new address is on file," he said simply. "If you'd like to direct the packing, now would be the time." She swallowed hard, looking at the paper again. At the bottom, beneath Ian's message, an address had been typed out. She didn't recognize it. She looked around the house at the framed pictures on the walls, the books stacked by the window, the coat draped over the back of a chair. Everything was being pulled out from under her, and she hadn't even seen it coming. The workers had already started, moving methodically, pulling down shelves, rolling up rugs. "Wait," she said, her voice thin. I need a second." They'd barely paused. Evelyn backed up, feeling like a stranger in her own home. She reached for her phone, fingers fumbling as she scrolled for Ian's name. Her thumb hovered over the call button. He had to answer. He had to explain. She pressed it to her ear. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. A chair scraped against the floor. Boxes were being stacked. The sounds were wrong, like the house was being hollowed out around her. One of the workers approached. "Mrs. Cross, if you could direct us to the master bedroom, we'll get started there." She looked at him, words failing her. The letter was still clutched in her hand. She thought of Ian's precision, his quiet efficiency, the way he planned everything down to the smallest detail. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. He had done this on purpose. Evelyn inhaled sharply, turning toward the stairs. "First room at the top," she said, the words barely escaping her lips. The workers moved without hesitation. She felt herself slipping out of place, as though her own body didn't belong here anymore. Her mind whirled, trying to fit the pieces together, trying to see what she had missed. The coffee had gone cold on the counter. The scent still lingered, but it was empty now, like everything else in the house. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing through the shaking. Ian knew. He had known for a while. And he had planned this down to the last second. The clipboard trembled slightly in the man's grip, though his expression remained neutral, unreadable. Evelyn stared at him, the words filtering through the air like static. "Mrs. Cross, we're here to pack up your things. You're being relocated." Relocated. The word didn't belong in this moment in her life. It belonged in military orders, in corporate transfers, in whispered plans between people starting fresh. It didn't belong here, in her home, in a conversation with two strangers in uniform, their truck rumbling in the driveway like a countdown she hadn't been aware of. She shook her head, gripping the edge of the doorframe. "No, that's wrong. I didn't request anything." The man exhaled, not unkindly, but with the patience of someone who had done this before. "We have a work order, signed by Ian Cross. Everything here is scheduled to be packed and moved today." The clipboard was lifted, tilted toward her. Her gaze landed on the bottom of the page, on the signature that made her stomach clench. Ian. She took a half step back, her body moving before her mind could catch up. It felt like standing at the edge of a drop-off, feet hovering over an abyss. This isn't possible," she whispered. She expected hesitation, a second of doubt, a delay that might allow her to gather her bearings. But there was none. The men behind him were already moving, stepping around her, into her space, into the house she had built a life in. The first crash of a cabinet door swinging open jolted her out of her daze. A rustling sound followed. Shelves being emptied, objects being placed into boxes. The worker in front of her held out another envelope, this one thicker, heavier in his palm. "Mr. Cross left this for you, in case you had any questions." Her fingers curled around it before she could think better of it. The paper was crisp, as if it had been prepared days ago, waiting for this moment. Evelyn tore it open, her breath short. Inside were more than words. There were papers, bank statements, documents, pictures. She flipped through them, too fast to process, her brain only catching pieces, flashes. A hotel lobby. Her face turned slightly toward the camera, unaware of its presence. The time stamp from 3 months ago. A second picture. Matthew. A second hotel visit. A different night. Her breath stuttered. She peeled back another page, her stomach twisting. A legal document. A divorce filing. Filed. Processed. Already in motion. Everything was unraveling in her hands, and she was still catching up. Ian had known. He hadn't confronted her, hadn't yelled, hadn't broken a glass or thrown accusations in the night. He had planned, calculated, set a trap so complete that by the time she found out, it had already snapped shut. Her fingers gripped the pages, pressing into them hard enough to crease. The moving men were working efficiently, their steps heavy against the hardwood floors. She barely heard them anymore, lost in the rushing sound in her ears. Her phone. She fumbled for it, hands shaking as she scrolled. Matthew. Her thumb hovered over the call button, the screen glaring at her. She hit dial, pressing it to her ear. 3 rings, then voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. A sick weight settled in her chest, cold and suffocating. She pressed the phone to her forehead, closing her eyes. What if Ian had already gotten to him? A chair scraped loudly across the floor. A stack of books thudded into a box. A worker moved past her with a roll of packing tape. She forced herself to take a breath, her mind grabbing at something solid, something tangible. She needed answers. Ian wasn't here. He had removed himself from this, just like he had removed her. But someone had to know. Her fingers found Carter's name in her contacts. Ian's best friend. The only person who might still talk to her. The call connected. Carter's voice came through, edged with wariness. Evelyn. She inhaled sharply. Carter, what the hell is going on? A pause. A too long silence. Then his voice, low. Ian told me you'd be calling. Her stomach twisted. Then tell me what this is. Why the hell are movers in my house? Why is my bank account frozen? Why is my car missing? Where is Ian? Carter exhaled, and she could hear the reluctance in it, the weight of something already decided. Ev. He planned this. For weeks. Maybe longer. Her grip tightened on the phone. Planned what? Another pause. Then, finally, he doesn't just want to leave you, Eve. He wants you to suffer. To disappear. The words knocked the breath from her lungs. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. The house around her was being packed into pieces, disassembled like it had never belonged to her in the first place, and Ian had orchestrated it all. Carter sighed on the other end of the line. I told him this was too far. But you know Ian, when he makes up his mind. Evelyn swallowed, her throat raw. Where's Matthew? Silence. Her blood went cold. Carter. A beat. Then, quietly, you should stop looking for him. The words settled deep, twisting under her ribs. A worker called from across the room, holding up a set of keys. Mrs. Cross, do you know where the spare car key is? She turned, barely recognizing her own voice. The car's gone. Yeah, the man said. We're supposed to deliver it to the new address. Her head pounded. A new address. A place Ian had chosen. Carter's voice was still in her ear. Evelyn, he said, and she could hear something in it now. A warning. This isn't just about the divorce. You need to leave. Now. The words crashed into her. Her body moved before she had fully processed them, her feet carrying her out of the kitchen, past the half-packed boxes, past the men working as though none of this was abnormal. Her breath came fast as she reached for the front door. The street outside was too quiet. The truck's engine rumbled. Her car was gone. Her bank account was frozen. Ian had planned this. Not just to leave her. To erase her. The walls of her life were closing in, and for the first time, she realized she might not just be losing everything. She might be in real danger. Evelyn stood in the middle of the stripped-down living room, watching the last of the boxes disappear out the door. The movers worked with efficiency, not bothering to ask questions. The walls, once covered with framed photos, were bare. The shelves that had held books, souvenirs, and pieces of a life built over years were empty. The sound of tape ripping and cardboard shifting filled the hollow space where her home had once existed. Her home. No, not anymore. She had spent the last hour trying to call Anne. He never picked up. The realization hit her like a second wave of nausea. He wasn't going to. He had made sure she had no way of stopping what was happening. Then she had tried Matthew. First his personal number. Then his work phone. Then every contact she could think of. Voicemail. Every time. She gritted her teeth, gripping her phone so tightly her fingers ached. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her flinch. For a split second, she thought Ian had finally shown up to face her. She rushed to the door, heart hammering. Not Ian. A silver sit-in. A man in a suit stepping out. A lawyer. Evelyn took a step back, dread settling heavy in her stomach. The man adjusted his tie, checked a leather folder in his hands, then looked up at her with an expression that was unreadable but vaguely apologetic. Mrs. Cross. Her throat was dry. She nodded. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Cross. I have instructions and final paperwork for you. May I come in? She didn't move. The lawyer hesitated before continuing. I understand this must be a difficult time, but my client has requested that this process be handled smoothly. I have legal documents regarding your financial status, asset distribution, and housing arrangements. I also have instructions for you to leave town by the end of the day. The words sank in slowly. Excuse me. The lawyer maintained his professional tone. Your belongings are being moved to the address listed in these documents. You will also find details regarding the dissolution of your accounts, as well as the terms of your divorce. Per Mr. Cross's arrangements, you will have until midnight to vacate. Midnight. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. This is my house. The lawyer's expression didn't change. Not anymore. As of noon today, ownership was transferred. You are no longer listed on the property deed. She felt the walls closing in. Ian had covered every angle, every possible escape. The lawyer extended the folder toward her. I strongly advise you to look over these documents and comply. If you resist, I have been instructed to proceed with alternative measures, including the release of certain information to your employer. Evelyn's breath caught. What? He pulled out a single sheet of paper and handed it to her. It was an email, addressed to her company's HR department. Attached to it were the photos from the hotel, the financial transactions between her and Matthew, and a formal complaint. Her body turned cold. Your employer has a strict policy against fraternization that could lead to conflicts of interest, the lawyer said evenly. This information will be sent out if you refuse to leave quietly. A threat? No. A promise. Evelyn's heart pounded against her ribs. If her company received this, her career would be over. Years of work, years of building a reputation, gone in an instant. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay steady. And if I leave? The lawyer slid the folder back into place. The email stays unsent. You'll be provided with enough to establish yourself elsewhere, not a cent more. Her hands trembled as she took the folder. I want to talk to Ian. That won't be possible. Her nails dug into the leather cover. Then I want to talk to Matthew. For the first time, something flickered across the lawyer's face. A hesitation. A pause too long to be casual. He is unavailable. Evelyn narrowed her eyes. What does that mean? I don't have further details. Liar. Her pulse spiked. Ian had gone after Matthew too. Maybe not with movers and lawyers, but he had done something. The thought sent panic rising up her throat. She flipped through the documents, scanning the legal jargon. The numbers in the financial records were gut-wrenching. The joint accounts, drained. Her savings, emptied. Every single account with her name on it had been closed, leaving her with barely enough to scrape by. Ian had taken everything. Her vision blurred for a second. Mrs. Cross, the lawyer said, voice measured, I recommend you pack whatever essentials you need and vacate before the deadline. We will ensure the transition is handled as smoothly as possible. But if you attempt to stay or fight this, the consequences will be immediate. She lifted her head. Did he tell you to say that? The lawyer didn't answer. A long, heavy silence stretched between them. Then, with stiff movements, Evelyn snapped the folder shut and hugged it to her chest. I'll be gone before midnight, she said through gritted teeth. The lawyer nodded once. That would be best. Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Evelyn watched the sedan pull away, disappearing down the street, leaving behind only the dull hum of the moving truck and the crushing weight of what had just happened. She had no home, no money, no way to fight back without losing everything else. And Matthew. Her fingers tightened around the folder. She needed to find him. Now. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and fryer grease, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions, just took orders and moved on. Evelyn slid into a cracked vinyl booth in the far corner, facing the door. She kept her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, not for warmth, but to keep them from shaking. She had called Carter twice before he finally answered. His voice had been tight, wary. But when she insisted she just wanted to talk, he agreed to meet. Now she waited, stomach twisting, head pounding. A bell jingled as the door swung open. Carter stepped in, looking around before spotting her. His face was unreadable, but his movements were cautious, as if he were walking into something he wasn't sure he could get out of. He slid into the booth across from her, resting his forearms on the table. "Ev." His voice was low, edged with something she couldn't quite name. She swallowed hard. "Thanks for coming." He glanced at the coffee between them, then back at her. "I shouldn't be here." Her throat tightened. "You're the only person I can talk to." Carter exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Ian told me not to get involved." Of course he did. Ian had covered every angle. He had taken everything, erased every trace of her from the life they built, and now he wanted to make sure she had no one left. She leaned forward. "Please, Carter, I just need to know the truth. I need to understand why." His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. For a long moment, he studied her, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he exhaled sharply. "This wasn't a snap decision," he said finally. "Ian planned this for months. He didn't just want to leave, Evie. He wanted to destroy you." A chill swept through her. "I need to find Matthew," she said, voice unsteady. Carter hesitated. She caught the flicker of something in his eyes before he masked it. "What happened to him?" His fingers tapped against the table, a nervous tick. "Ian didn't just go after you. Matthew got caught in the web too." Her chest tightened. "Where is he?" Carter shook his head. "You need to stop looking for him, Eve." That wasn't an answer. She gripped the edge of the table. "Is he alive?" Carter's gaze flickered to the side before he exhaled. "I don't know." Her stomach twisted. He leaned in, lowering his voice. "Ian didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to erase you. Make you disappear. You weren't supposed to have a chance to fight back." She swallowed against the rising nausea. "He took your money, your house, your job. You think he wouldn't take out the other person in the equation?" She shook her head. "No, this doesn't make sense. Ian isn't." Carter scoffed. "You don't know who Ian is anymore." The words felt like a slap. Carter ran a hand through his hair. "Look, I don't know exactly what he did, but I know Matthew got hit hard. He lost his job. His bank accounts were frozen. He went dark." Her pulse pounded. "He wouldn't just leave. Not without telling me." Carter's eyes hardened. Maybe he didn't have a choice. The reality of it settled over her like a weight. Ian had wiped out everything, not just for her, but for Matthew too. And if Carter was right, if Ian had truly planned this down to the last detail, then Matthew wasn't just missing. He was being kept away. She sat back, her pulse hammering. "You don't get it, do you?" Carter's voice was quiet but sharp. "This wasn't revenge. This wasn't just about the affair. Ian wants you to disappear, Evie. He doesn't want you to land on your feet. He wants you gone." The words echoed in her head. She forced herself to breathe. "What do I do?" Carter hesitated. "You leave town. You take what's left, and you run before Ian finishes what he started." Her stomach turned. She couldn't run. Not yet. She needed to find Matthew. She needed to know the truth. But Carter was already pushing away from the table. "This is the last time we talk," he said. "If Ian finds out I met with you." He let the words hang. They both knew what it meant. She swallowed hard. "Carter, please." But he was already walking away. She sat there, staring at the swirling dregs of her coffee, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. Ian had set a trap. But he had underestimated one thing. She wasn't done fighting. Evelyn sat in her car, engine running, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The parking garage was mostly empty, save for a few scattered vehicles coated in dust. The silence pressed in around her, amplifying the hum of the idling engine. She had spent the last 2 days chasing leads. None of them led anywhere. Matthew's apartment was empty, his phone disconnected, his usual haunts barren. His colleagues claimed they hadn't seen him in days, and his email bounced back with an automated out-of-office reply. Ian had made sure Matthew vanished, but he had left a trail. She reached over and grabbed the folder on the passenger seat. Inside were bank statements, transactions, a web of numbers and names that pointed to something bigger than a divorce. At first, she thought Ian had only wanted to punish her, to strip her of everything and leave her with nothing. But the offshore accounts, the hidden assets, the rapid financial movements, this was more than personal. This was calculated. She had spent the better part of the night digging. Ian had been moving money long before he found out about her and Matthew. Large withdrawals from their joint accounts, deposits into shadow corporations she had never heard of. And then, tucked between legal jargon and wire transfers, she found the link to Matthew. A $250,000 transaction, sent to a private investment firm under Matthew's name. She didn't believe in coincidences anymore. Her foot hovered over the gas pedal. She should leave. Get as far away as possible before Ian tightened the noose. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she knew the truth. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number she had found listed under the firm's registered address. It rang twice before a mechanical voice answered. Westgate Financial. Please state your inquiry. She forced her voice steady. I need to confirm an account transaction under the name Matthew Warren. A pause. Then a click. 1 moment. A minute stretched into 2. Evelyn's pulse quickened. Then a new voice came on the line, deeper, more cautious. Who is this? She swallowed hard. I'm trying to reach Matthew. I was told he had business with your firm. Another pause. Matthew is no longer associated with us, the voice said. If you have concerns, I suggest you speak to your attorney. She leaned forward. I just need to know where he is. The line went dead. Her stomach churned. She was right. Ian hadn't just ruined Matthew. He had made him disappear. She sat there for a long moment, gripping her phone, staring at the dark screen. If Matthew was involved in whatever Ian had been hiding, then he was either running or buried. And she had no idea which. She exhaled, trying to steady her hands. Then she reached for the second address in her folder. The one that didn't belong to a corporation. The one that belonged to Ian. A villa. Hidden outside the city, listed under a corporate shell company. It hadn't appeared on any of their financial records until last month. A place Ian never mentioned. A place he had tried to keep secret. She shoved the car into drive. She needed to see it for herself. The drive took nearly an hour, winding through empty roads, past stretches of land that blurred together under the setting sun. When she finally spotted the turnoff, it was almost invisible. A single dirt road cut into the hillside, shielded by thick trees. She hesitated at the entrance. If she was right, Ian had been using this place to move money, to stash assets, maybe even to hide Matthew. If she was wrong, she was dragging straight into a trap. She pressed down on the accelerator. The road twisted uphill, bumping over uneven ground. When the trees finally thinned, the villa came into view, a sleek, modern structure perched on the edge of a cliff, overlooking nothing but water. A single car was parked outside. Matthew's car. Her breath caught. She killed the engine, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to run. But she had come too far. She stepped out, moving quickly, keeping low. The villa was quiet, the glass windows reflecting the last traces of daylight. She approached the front entrance, pausing at the door. Unlocked. Her fingers trembled as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool, sterile. Polished floors, minimalist furniture. It didn't feel lived in. It felt temporary. She stepped forward, scanning the room. A half-empty glass of wine sat on the counter. A jacket draped over the back of a chair. Someone had been here. She moved deeper inside, listening. A faint hum of electronics. The distant crash of waves. And then, a voice. "You weren't supposed to come here." She spun around. Matthew stood in the hallway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Her breath caught. "You're alive." A slow, deliberate nod. Her chest tightened. "Where the hell have you been?" His gaze flickered, something dark passing over his face. "Evelyn, you need to leave." She took a step forward. "Not until you tell me the truth." His jaw clenched. "It's not safe." She shook her head. "Ian did this to us. He took everything. And you." She gestured around them. "You're here. In his house." A long silence stretched between them. Then Matthew exhaled. "You don't understand." Her stomach twisted. "Then make me understand." He hesitated. Then, quietly, "I was never just your mistake, Eve." A chill ran down her spine. Matthew wasn't the victim. He was part of the plan. Evelyn's breath came sharp and fast. Her body had gone cold, her mind trying to process the weight of Matthew's words. "I was never just your mistake, Eve." He stood there, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The air in the villa was thick with something she couldn't place. Anticipation, calculation, the feeling of a door slowly closing behind her. She swallowed hard. "You were in on this." Matthew exhaled, shaking his head. "Not at first." A bitter laugh escaped her. "That's supposed to make me feel better." He took a slow step forward. She matched it with one backward. "Evelyn, listen to me," he said, voice calm, controlled. "Ian had this in motion long before you and I ever happened. I was just useful." Her stomach twisted. "You were playing me." He hesitated, a flicker of something in his eyes. "Guilt, maybe." "No," he said, and for a second, it almost sounded like the truth. "But Ian had me by the throat before I even knew what was happening. He knew about my debt. He knew I was desperate. He made me an offer, and at first, it was just about money." She gritted her teeth. "And then?" Matthew looked past her, jaw clenched. "Then I met you." Something in his voice wavered, but she wasn't buying it. "And what, Matthew? You thought you could have it both ways. Sleep with me while feeding Ian everything he needed to destroy me." He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. "I didn't know how deep he was going to go. I thought." He shook his head. "It doesn't matter. He was never going to let you walk away from this clean." Her heart pounded against her ribs. The walls of the villa felt closer now. The weight of Ian's plan, of Matthew's involvement, of everything she had been trying to piece together. It was suffocating. "You don't get to act like this wasn't your choice," she spat. "You could have warned me." Matthew laughed, dry and humorless. "And then what?" Ian had everything mapped out, Eve. He had the money, the power, the connections. He wasn't just going to ruin you. He was going to erase you. She forced herself to stay steady, to not let the panic crawling up her spine take over. "And you let him." His gaze flickered. "I tried to stop him." She scoffed. "Right. That's why you're here. In his house. Drinking his wine." Matthew's jaw tensed. "I had nowhere else to go." A sick realization crept in. "He turned on you too." He didn't answer. She took another step back, her mind racing. "You thought you were on his side, but you weren't. You were just another pawn." His expression darkened. "We both were." She shook her head. "No, I didn't choose this. You did." A long silence stretched between them. Matthew's shoulders sagged, just for a moment. "Where is he?" she asked. Matthew's lips pressed into a thin line. "Gone. Cleaning up loose ends." Her stomach dropped. "And me." A slow exhale. "You were supposed to disappear." Ice trickled through her veins. She turned slightly, eyes scanning the villa, looking for the nearest exit. The way Matthew stood, the way he was watching her now, it was different. Like he was weighing something. Like he was making a decision. She knew she had seconds, maybe less. "Matthew," she said quietly. He stepped closer. "I'm sorry, Iv." She moved. A sharp turn, a burst of motion, her feet slamming against the polished floor. She bolted for the door, heart pounding. Matthew lunged. Fingers closed around her wrist, yanking her back. She twisted, bringing her elbow up, catching him hard against the side of his face. He cursed, grip loosening for a fraction of a second. Just enough. She tore free, stumbled toward the door. A hand grabbed at the back of her shirt. She ripped forward, the fabric stretching, tearing. She slammed into the doorframe, pain blooming up her side. But she didn't stop. Not now. Not when she finally understood. Ian hadn't just planned to take everything. He had planned to make sure she never got the chance to fight back. She crashed into the night, legs burning, the wind sharp against her face. The cliffside loomed ahead, to her right. The road. Her car. If she could just get there first. Matthew's footsteps pounded behind her. "Evelyn, stop." She didn't. She sprinted for the car, fumbling for the keys in her pocket. She yanked the door open, dove inside, slammed it shut. Matthew reached the driver's side, hands slamming against the window. "Evelyn, listen to me." She jammed the key into the ignition. His fist hit the glass. "You don't know what you're doing." She turned the key. The engine roared to life. "You don't get it," he shouted. "If you leave now, you won't make it out of this alive." She threw the car into reverse. Matthew stepped back. She hit the gas. The tires spun against the dirt, the car jerking back, then forward. She didn't look back. Didn't slow down. Not until the villa was nothing but a dark shape in the distance, swallowed by the night. Not until she realized she was driving toward something bigger than revenge. She was driving toward survival. Evelyn's hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her pulse hammering in her ears. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the dark, but every shadow, every flicker of headlights in the distance, made her chest tighten. She kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting Matthew to appear behind her, chasing her down. But the villa was long behind her now. She exhaled sharply and forced herself to focus. She had the upper hand now. Barely, but she had it. Her phone lay on the passenger seat. The screen cracked from when it had hit the floor during the struggle. Her mind raced through everything that had just happened. Matthew had been in on it. Ian's plan wasn't just revenge. It was a complete erasure. And she had been one breath away from vanishing forever. She needed proof. Her eyes flicked to the dashboard clock. Almost midnight. She didn't have much time. The idea hit her like a cold slap. Ian had built this entire web carefully, methodically. He wouldn't have left anything to chance, which meant if Matthew had a role in this, there had to be a record of it somewhere. Conversations, payments, evidence. And if there was one thing she had learned about Matthew, it was that he was too arrogant to cover his tracks completely. Evelyn's hands tightened on the wheel as she made a sharp turn onto an empty side street. A few more blocks, and she reached the place she was looking for, Matthew's office building. The parking lot was empty, save for a few security lights casting eerie shadows across the pavement. She cut the engine and sat there for a moment, steadying her breath. If she was going to do this, she had to move fast. She grabbed her phone, shoving it into her pocket before stepping out of the car. The cool night air wrapped around her as she hurried across the lot, keeping close to the wall. The building was dark, the entrance locked, but she knew Matthew. He was careless in small ways. She checked the side door. Locked. Her stomach twisted. She scanned the area. Security cameras in the far corner, but no movement inside. The building wasn't high security. Matthew had never needed it. She hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulling out the keycard she had swiped from Matthew's car back at the villa. She pressed it against the reader. A beep. A green light. The lock clicked open. Her pulse pounded as she slipped inside, closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. The air smelled of stale coffee and paper, the scent of long hours and late nights. The hall was empty, the sound of her own breathing too loud in the silence. She knew exactly where to go. Matthew's office was on the 3rd floor. She moved quickly, her shoes barely making a sound against the carpet. Every step sent another wave of adrenaline through her, but she pushed it down. She had to be smart about this. At the top of the stairs, she hesitated. A faint glow came from under Matthew's door. Her stomach clenched. Someone was inside. She pressed herself against the wall, listening. A voice. Low, controlled. Talking to someone. She edged closer, heart hammering. No, it's not handled yet. Matthew's voice was tense. She got away. A pause. A sharp inhale. I told you I had it under control, Matthew hissed. She wasn't supposed to make it out of there. Evelyn clenched her fists. You think I don't know what's at stake? Matthew snapped. I'll fix it. I just need time. Silence. Then. Ian, listen to me. Her breath caught. She pressed herself closer to the door, barely daring to breathe. She doesn't have anything yet, Matthew continued. But if she starts digging in the right places, that could change. We need to move faster. Another pause. No. I don't know where she is. Evelyn turned and slipped down the hall before she could hear anything else. Ian was still in control, still watching. She had to move now. She didn't have time to search Matthew's office. She didn't need to. He had already confirmed everything she needed to know. Ian wasn't just trying to ruin her. He was tracking her every move. And if she wanted to survive this, she had to strike first. She made it down the stairs and back out into the night, keeping low as she reached her car. Her hands were shaking as she unlocked the door, slid inside, and turned the key. The engine rumbled to life. She pulled away from the building, breathing hard. She had what she needed. Now she just had to use it. Evelyn parked in a dimly lit alley, her hands still trembling from the adrenaline crash. The city hummed around her, distant traffic, a siren wailing somewhere in the night. She gripped the steering wheel, inhaling sharply, forcing herself to focus. She had made it out of the villa. She had escaped Matthew. But escape wasn't enough. Not yet. She pulled her phone from her pocket, the cracked screen flickering to life. The voice recording app was still open, still running. She pressed play, listening to Matthew's voice, tight with frustration, with fear. She wasn't supposed to make it out of there. If she starts digging in the right places, that could change. Ian, listen to me. Her stomach clenched. It was enough. Enough to prove Ian and Matthew had been working together. Enough to show Ian hadn't just taken everything from her. He had tried to erase her. But proof wasn't power. Not yet. She needed help. Her thumb hovered over Carter's number. He had warned her to run. He had made it clear this wasn't her fight. But Carter wasn't innocent in this. He had known what Ian was doing, maybe not all of it, but enough. And she needed an ally. She hit call. 1 ring. 2. Then. A groggy voice. Evelyn. She exhaled in relief. Carter. I need you. Silence. She could almost hear him deciding, weighing his loyalty, his self-preservation against whatever shred of guilt still existed. Then, a resigned sigh. Where are you? The cafe Carter chose was one of those 24-hour places that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Evelyn sat in a booth at the back, put up, hands wrapped around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. Carter slid in across from her, looking tired, like a man who had spent too many nights wrestling with his conscience. You look like hell, he muttered. Thanks, she said flatly. His eyes flicked over her, checking for bruises, for anything out of place. Did he hurt you? Not for lack of trying. Carter sat back, exhaling. "Tell me." She pulled out her phone and hit play. Matthew's voice spilled into the space between them, low and tense. Carter listened, his expression tightening with every word. When the recording ended, he scrubbed a hand over his face. "Jesus Christ. You knew he wanted to ruin me," Evelyn said. "Did you know he wanted to kill me?" Carter's jaw tensed. "Not like this." She swallowed down the anger, the betrayal. "Well, now you do. And I need your help." He shook his head. "Ev, Ian is still in control," she cut in. "Matthew made that clear. He has the money, the influence. He'll spin this however he wants. I can't just expose him. I need to take him down." Carter let out a slow breath. "You have no idea what you're up against." "I don't care." He studied her, something shifting in his eyes. "You really aren't the woman I remember." "No," she agreed. "I'm not." A beat. Then Carter reached into his pocket and slid a USB drive across the table. "This is everything I have on Ian. Bank transfers, shell companies, offshore accounts. Nothing solid enough to get him arrested, but enough to get the right people interested." Evelyn picked it up, her pulse quickening. "Why do you have this?" "Because I've been watching him too," Carter admitted. "Ian's not just screwing over his wife. He's been bleeding his own company dry. Stealing from investors, laundering money. He's careful, but not perfect." She gripped the drive. "Then we make him pay for it." Carter exhaled. "You really think you can win?" She met his eyes. "I don't have a choice." The plan came together in the hours before dawn. Evelyn worked in the back of Carter's car, laptop open, fingers flying over the keys. She had been a corporate wife long enough to know how Ian worked. She knew where he hid his secrets, the way he built his walls. And now she had a way inside. The first move was simple. Make noise. She sent the audio recording to every major news outlet, every financial watchdog, every corporate investigator she could find. She didn't have proof of murder, but she had proof of conspiracy, of fraud, of enough wrongdoing to send reporters scrambling. Within minutes, emails started pinging back. Requests for interviews. Questions she had no intention of answering. The second move was harder. She hacked into Ian's corporate network. Carter had given her access to one of Ian's executive accounts, a digital backdoor that Ian had used to shuffle money through his companies. Evelyn traced the transactions, following them like breadcrumbs, until she found what she was looking for. The offshore accounts. Millions. It wasn't just Ian's money. It was stolen funds, client investments funneled into private accounts, fraudulent transactions masked as legitimate expenses. Evelyn copied everything. Then she hit send. The files went to every major regulatory agency, every federal investigator. Ian had spent years building his empire, stacking the odds in his favor. But Evelyn had just pulled the foundation out from under him. She sat back, pulse racing. Carter whistled. "You just declared war." "Good." By morning, the storm had started. News sites exploded with headlines. A corporate scandal, a financial investigation, whispers of fraud, of embezzlement. Reporters swarmed Ian's company headquarters. Investors pulled their funds. Stock prices plummeted. And Evelyn knew Ian was watching it all burn. Her phone buzzed. A blocked number. She answered. A slow inhale on the other end. Then, "You don't know what you've done." Ian's voice. Calm. Controlled. But underneath it, something cold. Evelyn smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Oh, I think I do." A long silence. Then Ian spoke again, softer this time. "You should have run when you had the chance." Evelyn's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm done running." The line went dead. She exhaled slowly, her hand steady now. Ian was losing control. And she wasn't finished yet. Evelyn sat in the darkened car, her fingers wrapped around the steering wheel, her breath steady but sharp. The city outside pulsed with movement, headlights slicing through the night, distant sirens wailing, the hum of people going about their lives. She had spent the last few weeks in the shadows, tearing down Ian's empire piece by piece, striking at him from places he never expected. And now, there was nothing left to dismantle. It was time to end this. Her phone buzzed beside her. A single message from Carter. He's at the penthouse. Alone. She exhaled slowly, gripping the key in the ignition. Ian always operated from a position of power, always the one orchestrating, controlling, predicting. But now, the balance had shifted. He was cornered, and he knew it. She had watched it unfold in real time. The frozen accounts, the legal notices, the board members turning on him. His name dragged across headlines. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. Every move he made, she had been one step ahead. His allies abandoned him. The company severed ties. His assets were locked down. And Matthew, he had disappeared. Maybe he ran. Maybe he didn't make it out at all. It didn't matter. Evelyn wasn't looking for him. She was looking for Ian. Her grip tightened on the wheel. One last move. One final confrontation. The end of the game. She stepped out of the car, crossing the empty street toward the high-rise building. The penthouse sat at the top, unreachable to anyone without clearance, but Ian's world had cracks now, and she had learned how to slip through them. She walked through the front doors, past the empty lobby, past the security desk that had been abandoned when Ian's company imploded. No guards, no assistants, just silence. She entered the elevator, pressed the top floor button, and felt the slow ascent. The mirrored walls reflected back a woman she barely recognized. Sharp, steady, unafraid. The woman Ian had tried to erase. The doors slid open. The penthouse was dark except for the glow of the city through floor-to-ceiling windows. She stepped inside, the quiet pressing against her ears. The space had been gutted, furniture removed, artwork taken down, as if Ian had already resigned himself to exile. And then she saw him. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, shoulders squared but heavy. He had lost weight. His tailored suit hung looser than it once did, his face drawn, eyes shadowed. He wasn't the untouchable man he had been weeks ago. The power had drained from him, leaving behind something brittle, something human. He didn't turn when she entered. "You took everything from me," he said, voice calm, almost detached. Evelyn let the door click shut behind her. "You were planning to do the same." Ian let out a short, humorless laugh. "I suppose I was." He turned then, eyes meeting hers. "But I never thought you had it in you." She stepped closer, feeling the weight of every moment that had led to this. "You underestimated me." A smirk flickered across his lips, but it didn't last. "I did." Silence stretched between them. The city buzzed beyond the glass, but here, in this hollow space, there was nothing but the final remnants of what they had been. Ian exhaled slowly. "So this is it. You came to watch me burn." "No." Her voice was steady. "I came to finish it." A flicker of something in his gaze. Wariness. Resignation. But not fear. Ian had never been afraid. Not of her. Not of consequences. He had always believed himself untouchable. Until now. "The authorities will be here soon," she said. "They have everything they need. The financial records, the offshore accounts, the investors you stole from. You're done, Ian." His jaw tensed. "You really think prison will break me?" "I don't care if it does." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them. "This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure you never do this to anyone else." He studied her, the weight of her words sinking in. For the first time, something in his expression cracked. Not fear, but something close. A realization. "You think you've won," he murmured. "I know I have." A long silence. Then, Ian nodded once, almost as if in acceptance. He turned back to the window, his hands still in his pockets. "They'll come for me soon." "Yes." Another beat of silence. Then, so softly, she almost didn't hear it. Was it worth it? Evelyn's throat tightened. She thought of everything she had lost, everything she had been forced to become, the pieces of her that had been stripped away, not just by Ian, but by the fight itself. She exhaled. Yes. Ian didn't argue, didn't challenge her. He just nodded again, slow, thoughtful. The sound of sirens cut through the night, distant but growing closer. Evelyn turned toward the door. She had no more words for him, no more energy to waste on a man who had already lost. She stepped out of the penthouse, leaving Ian behind. By the time she reached the street, the red and blue lights flashed against the glass above. She watched as the cars pulled up, as the officers moved inside. And then she turned and walked away, not looking back, not once. Epilogue. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, a vast, shifting expanse of blue and gold under the late afternoon sun. Waves rolled in gentle, rhythmic whispers, licking at the shore and retreating just as quickly. Evelyn Cross sat on a weathered wooden chair outside a small, nameless cafe, the scent of salt and citrus hanging thick in the warm air. A new name, a new life. She wrapped her fingers around a glass of something cold, condensation pooling against her skin. She took a slow sip, feeling the tang of lime cut through the warmth of the afternoon. The world here moved differently, slower, softer. No one watched her. No one whispered her name in hushed voices, eyes darting toward news headlines. Here she was no one, and she had never felt more free. The small coastal town had been a last-minute decision, a pinpoint on a map chosen with nothing but instinct, a place Ian had never mentioned, never visited, never considered, a place untouched by the war she had waged and won. The fallout had been immediate. Ian's empire crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. The fraud, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, she had thrown everything into the light. The authorities had swarmed, the headlines relentless, the corporate vultures circling for what little remained of his fortune. She had watched it unfold from the shadows, waiting for the final move. And then, the moment had come. Ian Cross, once the untouchable king, led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of quiet fury. No last words, no final threats, just silence. She had turned and walked away, disappearing before the dust could settle, before anyone could ask her what came next. Because she had no answer. Not then, but now she was learning. The life she had built with Ian had been meticulous, curated, a series of controlled steps meant to create an illusion of happiness. The perfect wife, the polished existence, the structured routines. It had been a cage. Now her days were quiet, unstructured. She woke when the sun did, spent mornings walking the shoreline, afternoons reading books with dog-eared pages. She spoke to strangers without wondering if they knew her name. She made small choices just because she could, coffee or tea, sandals or bare feet, staying or leaving. She had never been able to do that before. A breeze rolled in from the water, tussling her hair, carrying laughter from a group of fishermen unloading their catch down by the docks. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle into her bones. She had survived. Not just Ian, not just Matthew, not just the careful, calculated destruction meant to erase her. She had survived herself. The woman she had been, the one who had spent years shrinking, doubting, waiting for permission. She was gone, and in her place was someone new. She felt it in the way her shoulders no longer tensed when the phone rang, in the way she no longer flinched at unexpected sounds, in the way she could sit here, watching the waves, feeling no need to check over her shoulder. She had won, and she was free. A shadow passed over her table. She blinked, looking up. The man standing there was older, his skin weathered from years in the sun, a notebook tucked under one arm. "You're new here," he said, his voice rough but kind. She nodded. He tilted his head toward an empty chair. "Mind if I join you?" For a moment, she hesitated. Not out of fear, just habit. Then she gestured to the seat. "Go ahead." He set down his notebook, ordering a drink from the passing waiter. When the silence stretched a little too long, he glanced at her with a knowing smile. "Most people who come here are running from something," he said, "or toward something." She let the words hang between them, the weight of their truth settling gently. "Which are you?" he asked. She thought about it. The Evelyn who had arrived here weeks ago, cautious and hollow, might have said running. But now. She exhaled, feeling the last remnants of her old life fall away like sand slipping through her fingers. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm just here." The man nodded, as if he understood. And for the first time in a long time, she did too. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.